Justin had an emergency he had to attend to, so I jumped in here. As Ashley said, I am the co-founder and CEO, so the second part to Justin there. Live in Denver, Colorado, which is also where we're headquartered, but you can probably hear that's not where I grew up. So let's get that out of the world. Grew up a little east of the Americas in a little kingdom called Denmark. So that's where the accent is from. But I've been here for more than 25 years, which sort of dates myself a bit, I guess, and all of that in retirement income planning. But super excited about the panel we have today. Michael, why don't we start with you? You want to quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Mike Kothakota. I am a financial planner. I've been one for over 20 years. I also teach ethics and financial mathematics at Columbia, and yeah, excited to be here. I've been on a few of the other ones of these, so but this one's going to be really fun.
Mr. Frazier, Brendan, you want to introduce yourself quick?
Yeah, hey everybody, I'm Brendan Frazier, the former or recovering financial planner advisor, now the chief behavioral officer at RFG Advisory. And of course, everybody always even my friends are always like, what in the world is that? Never heard of that before. Totally fair. But basically just helping to spread the message to clients, but especially to our advisors, and build tools and systems to help them think through and implement the human side, how to have conversations around the non-financial, more emotional, psychological aspects of working with clients and prospects.
Great. Derek, you want to jump in as well?
Yeah, Derek Tharp. I have my own small advisory practice, Conscious Capital. I also work as a head of innovation here at Income Lab, and also teach. I'm a professor at University of Southern Maine.
Great. Well, let's get this party started. Excited to have this conversation. So typically when we hear about or we read about Social Security and filing strategies, it tend to be really a mathematical conversation. Share with us why you think there is a psychological aspect to this as well. And what are some of the factors that advisors should be looking for when having these conversations? Any three of you can kind of take it off from there.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I mean, I think, there's the simple thing we can do, right? A lot of times when we're trying to answer a question, right, where can we go to get something? And looking at Social Security, the simplest thing we can do is just compare kind of the cash flows. When do we get the money? And we can treat it just like a mathematical exercise. I think there's a lot that really should be kind of challenged about that, though. And I know we're going to dive into all sorts of topics here today, but just thinking about the way that turning on or turning off that income actually increases somebody's willingness to spend, thinking about the way that people actually feel about their money in terms of feeling about the risk of delay or the risk of the mortality risk, which is actually a very, very real risk that is often completely ignored in a lot of the research. And just thinking about the way that we can do more with our money earlier in life when we have the health span, when we have the opportunity to do it. And a lot of those factors really get glossed over. We get into more of the technical side maybe later if it goes there. But when we're just doing kind of this, really simple discount rate kind of analysis, and often not even applying a discount rate. Most of the research, is using like a 0% discount rate, which I personally disagree with, but I'll kick it over to Mike or Brendan if they want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that the math and the psychology interact very well, because there's just a number of ways to really kind of to show it. I do, to your point, Derek, talking about things like, what you're doing earlier on in your life. Like, are you, we had an interesting conversation last week, I think talking about the next webinar where we were discussing, the same way people say things about do you think taxes are going to be lower now or in the future? When you're talking about things like putting money in a Roth IRA or doing Roth conversions, the same thing would be like, do you think you're going to be traveling more at 60 than you are at 80 when you've, been waiting so long for that? And the reality is most people are going to be the evidence suggests people do a lot of traveling early on and then they slow down. And just even being in my, mid 40s traveling, is hard. So like when I think about being 80 and trying to carry suitcases all over the world, it's just, I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think, okay, so from my vantage point, it kind of started. I first of all, I 100% agree with Michael's claim there that the numerical side and the psychological side, they play well together. They're both important. You don't dismiss either one of them. I think the reason that we're here is because by and large, as an industry, as a profession, as the research goes, that we tend to focus solely, or let's say more heavily, on the numerical side, the quantifiable side, right? Like, let's run this break-even analysis, and that should be the primary determinant that informs our decision of when to claim Social Security. And we lean heavily on that because it's hard to imagine a world in where you're a few years off in the future and you go, hey, I made a very logic-based decision and I regret it. We can always fall back on the comfort of going, well, I made a logical decision, what we think is logical. Well, then you start working with clients, and anecdotally speaking, you start working with them, you run these break-even analyses or analyses, whichever you prefer, probably analyses. You run those, and then you look at it numerically, and then you realize like they go and they make their decision, and it almost falls back to like, I'm overwhelmed, therefore I'm going to make an emotional or psychological decision. Classic example of that would be a client that I worked with. We ran all these numbers, ran the break even, showed him the pros and cons. Eventually he goes, I'm going to take it at 66. And I was like, okay, interesting. Hey, tell me how you landed on that. And he's like, well, mostly because that's when I always thought I was going to retire, and it's right in the middle. And it's like, okay, like that's not necessarily like the best way. It wasn't logical, but it had this pull of, hey, I feel like I'm supposed to retire at 66. I'm going to split the difference. And so it almost never really became this truly quantifiable numerical decision as much as we wanted it to be. So I always kind of felt this way, right? And then I stumble across this research because in my spare time, I like to do weird things like read psychology research, where we actually are influenced in these decisions psychologically. So there's this one like now fairly popular study out there that shows that the way that you frame the question changes people's responses. So they would ask people, they'd say, hey, do you expect to live to, or what age do you expect to live to? And then they would say, what age do you expect to die by? And the gap between those was about 10 years, plus or minus 10 years, just by changing the way they answered the question. And then what they found out were people who expected to live longer were more likely to delay their Social Security claiming, because they figured, hey, if I live longer, I can delay and I can get more money. And so it's kind of like, wait a minute. So just the way that I asked this question could ultimately impact the way that the strategy is initiated. And so you just realize like you have this hunch that this element's going on. Then you find out that there's this research out there. It's backed up that you need both elements. You need to have the number side, the numerical side, but we can't ignore the psychological piece. So that's kind of, I think that's why we're here, right? Is to figure out how do we best blend these two things together and become more aware of the psychological factors that are at play that are informing these decisions, whether we oftentimes realize it or not.
Super interesting. Kind of want to take a step back for a second and talk to why this is such an important conversation. It's estimated that right now, 11,000 Americans are turning 62 every single day. When we put that into perspective, that means we could fill out a Broncos stadium here in Denver every single week with people that are turning 62. And of course, those are the people that have to make these decisions, right? These are super important decisions. These are personal decisions for people. It's not just about the numbers. Now, when they make that decisions, in your experience, they choose to either file early or file late. Which one is more prevalent? And what are the factors that come into those preferences?
I think in my case, most people at least come in wanting to file early. I think that there's a question about people having anxiety around Congress reducing or benefits being reduced because of funds running out. And I think so usually that's kind of part of the conversation. And especially when I was working with people where Social Security like really, really mattered. I still work with those people, but like when they first started coming in, it was kind of it's a really difficult conversation. And I think part of it is if you think about Brendan was mentioning the research, and then and Derek mentioned the research, is that we can do all the research we want. But in most cases, the research that we're doing is looking at averages. It's looking at like, it's not looking at the individual situation. And one of the things I think about, like, is that these in-depth conversations of really trying to ask more questions, be more curious about your client, is going to get you to the place where you can help them more. Absolutely, the research is valuable. The research is valuable in like explaining certain things, in explaining the averages and talking about those things. But really drilling down to like, well, what does this client want to be doing next week, next year? What do they think about as far as, what gives them anxiety? Does Social Security give them anxiety? What do they want to be doing? And so I think, it really comes down to like just having those individual conversations, going deeper, asking more questions. This is incredibly challenging when when you're trying to scale, right? If you're trying to scale a practice, there are obvious, people like Brendan build in efficiencies and stuff like that to like make these conversations more efficient. But it is still time consuming if you really want to get to the correct strategy. So like, again, numbers, great. Tools like Income Labs, Social Security Optimizer, great, right? Because you can show them those numbers, and then going deeper and asking them how they feel about what you just showed them, what else they'd like to see, things like that.
Brendan?
Yeah, I think addressing the question of, why are we here? Why are we talking about this at the end of the day, really helping our clients figure out how do they live the best life they can with the resources they have. And I think, I actually do think, similar to Mike, I have an experience. Most people that come to me are more inclined to want to claim early. I do get some people that have maybe encountered some of the research, they've done some things like that have come in, no, I'm going to claim all the way, wait till 70. But that person is more rare in my experience than the person who just says, either I'm going to claim when I retire, I'm going to claim at 62, and then I'm going to retire. But I think there's actually probably some intuition that those people have, that we're not fully giving them credit for when you look at some of the research. And again, when I'm talking about research, I'm kind of really focused in on some of that 0% discount rate treats a dollar at 62 no different than a dollar at 95. I don't think that really holds. I would challenge kind of the premise of a lot of that research, and therefore the conclusions that come from it. But I do think, when we're looking at that, especially thinking about the kind of the return, the memory dividends, those types of things that people can get from spending, and from enjoying their retirement, really have to think carefully about how we structure an ideal income for them. And I think those psychological factors could, in some cases, lean claiming earlier than some of the other research might suggest.
Derek, this is probably not the best way to, as a panelist, to contribute, but I'm going to actually ask you, you have a story I think that was cool about a client, I think it was 62-year-old, where you guys
No,
were,
that's my client.
oh, that was Michael. Okay, all right, my bad. Yeah, Michael. I
Yeah.
feel like that'd be I think this is a great time to tell that. So I wish it was my story, so I could sweep in here and tell it. But I think this is a good time to kind of tell.
Yeah. So I actually have this. This is a painting that a client gave me shortly after she did her life trip, like something that she always wanted to do, art classes in Paris. And we had an emotional moment because when she came back, she had a series of tests, and it turned out she had a terminal illness. And the thing that she said to me was like, what got her to take that trip was taking Social Security early, so that she could feel comfortable that she had enough money to meet her expenses. And she said, I cannot thank you enough for for telling me to do that, which, like, it's advice, and that's what we do. But it is a pretty powerful example of that there are unplanned things that occur. Justin isn't on this call because he's at a funeral because somebody died. And we do a lot of planning. We're always throwing in like, how long are you going to live? It's always like something ridiculous, like 95. People aren't necessarily going to live that long. Sure, if you're affluent, you're probably more likely to live a little bit longer. So the idea is that financial planning clients are going to live longer. But again, it brings it back to, we're not talking about the averages. We're talking about individual clients with real experiences, real desires, real needs. And the answer and the advice has to fit the client and not what we think they should do based on some numbers. I told that story to this group when we were talking about what we were going to talk about in this call. And I do think it's not to say like, hey, like I just gave this person great advice. It's to say like, I didn't know at the time that she was going to have a terminal illness, but it does show that those things can happen. And that opportunities, we only live so long, our probability of dying increases as we age. There are more things, the universe is trying to kill you. There's so many things trying to kill us all the time. And, enjoying life, having people enjoy their money is what we do.
I think that's a great transition. I saw one of the comments to Team Income Lab, so I guess, Derek, that's you and I in this particular case, was, Social Security is about longevity insurance. And I agree with that. I mean, longevity risk is real. That, of course, is the risk, kind of an interesting way to say it, but the risk of you living a long life and therefore have to fund it. And generally, when you hear and read about Social Security, the rule of thumb is delay, delay, delay. In most cases, if you can delay to age 70, that is recommended. Derek, I know you have some strong thoughts and sort of some personal history around that. So you want to start out with that one, and then we can kind of pass it around.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Certainly, longevity insurance is a very real thing. Nobody here would deny that, and that's something we need to account for. It should be something that's any type of analysis we're doing for a client, something we want to be looking at. I do think the mortality risk side of it is often something that's really overlooked in a lot of the research, and that if somebody dies prematurely, that's going to mean that they may not get anything from Social Security. And speaking to kind of personal connection there, my father passed away earlier this year at 64, and he was still working, right? He paid into Social Security his entire life, never received anything back. Now, he was still working. I don't think he's particularly upset about it, but it's a situation where I definitely think especially thinking about maybe somebody who retired at 62 and who maybe wanted to claim at 62 but was kind of nudged by their advisor, no, let's delay, let's kick the can down the road, let's wait till 70. They get to 68 and they get a terminal illness diagnosis. I really think that person might have some regret that they didn't claim earlier. And that is one problem of looking at these averages kind of research when we're just looking on average. I think it's Nassim Taleb has a quote, something to the effect of, never cross a river that's on average 4 feet deep. And I think we do that a little bit with the research here because we really ignore the mortality risk, the sequence of returns risk, some of these front-loaded things that really come with delaying that haven't been accounted for in a lot of the research. And that focus is almost myopically kind of on just the longevity insurance, which is a very real benefit, and we don't want to deny that. But there's a lot of risks that are in there that are commonly overlooked. And so I think that's where, especially the psychological perspective, is where a lot of those come in. It starts to come in when we talk about how do people feel about their money, how do they spend their money, how do they become willing and even feel like they have the ability to retire. And Social Security can play a pretty big role in that.
Yeah, it actually it reminds me of my situation with my dad, where it's like he's been told or taught and read, he's informed. It's like, hey, you're supposed to delay until you're 70. And it's like, that's kind of what he's been told. That's what his friends have said. That's what his own research tells him. And it just seems to be this like clear cut, here's what you do. You wait till 70, you'll get the maximum benefit type of thing. Meanwhile, he's still working. And the thing that bothers me when we talk about it is it's like he's like, this is what I'm told that I'm supposed to do, so I'm going to do that. And then in the meantime, I'm going to keep working until I'm 70. What I know that I haven't necessarily told him, but I can see is that he's missing out on a lot of things that he could be doing, because he's like, hey, I can't come this weekend to see the kids' baseball game because I got some stuff I got to wrap up at the office. I got some stuff I have to knock out at the office before I can actually leave and then call it quits for the whatever. So from that vantage point, I look at it and think like, if we look at it purely from the human aspect, you go, so he's going to get more benefit at 70. He's going to maximize his benefit, but what is he going to miss? He's 65 now. Well, what's he going to miss in that 5-year window that could be possible if he started taking it now? And that gave him the freedom or the permission to say, okay, I don't need to work anymore. I can take off and start doing other things that I want to do. And the reason I mention it isn't because I don't know that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. I don't know that in fact, with all this, I don't think it's fair to say that there's a right or wrong decision whatsoever. What I think is that he's not making an informed enough decision. He's just defaulting to, oh, I need to wait till 70. And people are helping him think about that, the benefits of waiting longer. Nobody's sitting there helping him and guiding him through the process of, hey, what are the things you could be doing if you could retire sooner? If it meant claiming today meant you could retire sooner, would you do it? Nobody's helping him think through that aspect of it. It's just this like blanket, hey, wait till 70 advice. And that's the part that bothers me. Again, I don't think there's right or wrong, but to Michael's point earlier, I think it comes down to like, people just need help making this decision. There's a lot that goes into it, and we have to learn how to guide them through making this decision by weighing all the factors, not just longevity, but also like the mortality side, also the missed out experiences side. Just help them make a more informed decision to not just have more money, but to live a better life.
One of the comments, or some of the comments, talk about like the 8%. People focus on the 8%, like, hey, look, it's a guaranteed 8% return.
Yeah.
And there's no argument with that, right? That's great. That is a great, like, if you can get an 8% guaranteed return, like that tends to be pretty good. Although we could argue that, reduction in Social Security benefits kind of erodes that. But, I would ask a different question. I would say, okay, what is the value of a year with your granddaughter compared to the 8%? Is that 8% better than that time you're going to spend? I've been running with my daughter recently, and like I think about, like, if I had a W-2 job, I would have less time to do that. Yeah. And I can't put a price on it. I know that it's worth more than going to the office. That's what I know. Mm-hmm. So I think, and I'm 47. If you're 62 and your time is short and you've got a little time with the little ones, like it's a very real decision. Is the utility of that time in retirement greater than the benefits that your work benefits, the value that you receive from working with colleagues and all those things? Those are important, right? Because actually, we talk as advisors about like the struggle of retiring, because there is some value in working, but all of that has to be considered, or should be considered, as part of our job.
Yeah. I think that's another great example, because there's no right answer in that scenario, right? Like, what's more valuable? Is it what you're getting from your work and your job and the relationships and the purpose that you get from it, or the ability to have more freedom so that you can go visit your grandkids more frequently? There is no right answer there, but it's adding a dimension to the conversation, or I guess it's helping them think through all these important aspects of it, guiding a conversation that doesn't just focus on break-even analysis, but says, hey, let's think through what is the value of like taking it early so you can retire. Like, would you rather keep working, or would you rather have some time off to go visit your grandkids? To me, it's this idea of most people won't naturally go to that thought process, right? They don't naturally go there and think of it that easily. So that's the value we can bring, is helping illuminate this conversation to say, here are some things to think about in addition to the numerical side as you go about making this decision.
Yeah, I'm actually been thinking, a little bit on the psychology as an advisor in this, because and I see the 8%, the guaranteed 8% thrown around all the time. One important thing to realize, though, that's a guaranteed 8% increase in the benefit amount. It's not the same thing as a guaranteed 8% increase in your portfolio assets, your wealth. Like that actually, that's kind of its own little mathematical weird framing that we go down a whole rabbit hole of that. But to me, that's worth, like, even the way we think about it. And I'm somebody that's sitting here who it's only recently, after really sitting down and thinking about, like, wait a minute, like, should we factor in an opportunity cost? Right. Most of the research uses 0%. Should we change that? Like, should we factor in mortality risk? Should we factor in sequence of returns risk? Like, should we factor in all these different pieces that and a lot of that's been using the Income Lab tools to be able to illustrate some of those and stress test and see what different scenarios actually look like. That's actually, made me shift a little bit off of I used to be one of those always 70. If I can get you to delay, that's going to be better. That's going to be, the way to go. And really, the more I've thought about it, like 70 is sometimes the right decision. I'm not at all saying that 70 is always wrong, always right, always wrong. But I think there's a lot of things that really get overlooked and glossed over in a lot of the research that we should be thinking about a little bit more deeply as advisors, and how that impacts our clients, how that framing might influence their behavior. And so for me, that's where I've really come to more of a, like, actually, no, there's a lot of reasons why, especially if somebody's really inclined to claim earlier, maybe we should look at what that impact is on their total plan and see if there's a way to make that work.
I want to add
I want to, can I say something just real quick, John?
Please.
I think one thing that I think it feels like I think a lot of the things we're talking about is, like, it feels like we're leaning more towards the claiming early side, and I think a lot of the questions are kind of reflecting that. I think what we're trying to say is, like, the conversation needs to cover all factors. That's not to say some people shouldn't retire at 70. Some people should, and it makes sense, financially, psychologically, all of it makes sense that way. So we're definitely not saying that. I think we're saying that the conventional wisdom we should be skeptical of the conventional wisdom. That's what we're saying.
And I think even thinking about conventional wisdom, if there is a conventional wisdom, at least among the public, it's almost claim early. It's really among advisors ourselves that the conventional wisdom is the delay. So, and that's where I do think, again, intuitively, I think people are picking up on some of those mortality risk, and you can run the numbers, and somebody who has kind of a maximum benefit, they could be giving up as much as $400,000 of basically earnings that they could have brought in if they claimed at 62, but instead passed away right before their benefit, right? That's kind of the extreme, but that's a risk, again, that generally gets glossed over in a lot of the research. And again, seeing some of the scenarios, like seeing somebody going through a downturn and what that can do to a portfolio. If somebody was retiring or sorry, delayed claiming instead of claiming earlier, and what that kind of has as ripple effects on their behavior. Again, until using Income Lab to really model some of those out, I didn't even know as an advisor. And that's been pretty eye-opening to me personally.
Seeing some comments around actuarial science, Brendan, that's a space we've been in, so we have some experience there. I really think it's important. It was either Mike or Derek that mentioned, we cannot confuse, by the way, it's 8% simple, and on a future cash flow with 8% return on your portfolio. And think about annuities for a second. You don't need to go any further to the insurance industry. They will give you 8% symbol for the next 8 years, no problem. But it's on a future cash flow you may or may not get. And that's where the confusion lies, right? Like, it's sort of apples and oranges. You cannot confuse that with returns in your portfolio. Now, all of that said, when we do research on Social Security claiming, and typically this mathematically, we tend to sort of assume that we can change Social Security in isolation and that everything else stays the same. It doesn't have an impact on anything else, which I think is a strong assumption there. And would love to hear what you think about that, and also how, from a psychological perspective, that can change the conversation. Derek, I'm going to throw it over to you. So,
yeah. I mean, I think again, if we try to look at it in a vacuum, like that's just not how people behave. And there's some good research from Michael Finca, David Blanchett, this looked at like the way that people are willing to spend guaranteed, monthly income that they receive, like a pension income, annuity income, Social Security, differently than they're willing to spend portfolio income. And I think that's very real. And it's something I've encountered personally, even in the past, trying to encourage people. And, Justin Fitzpatrick and myself, we've written about the retirement distribution hatchet and kind of if you are delaying, but you retire earlier, maybe you're taking an 8%, 10% withdrawal in those early years from your portfolio. And I've had clients really push back and they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like I can't take 8% from my portfolio. This is, way too risky of a thing for me to do. And I tried, okay, well, mathematically, we're saying you're going to delay, your Social Security benefit will be higher in the future. So your distribution rate's really dropping to like a 2%. But those are scenarios where, that person was not comfortable with a plan that involved delaying claiming their Social Security because they looked at that as too high of a strain on their portfolio. And, I could argue with them all day, but I don't know that I'm going to move them off of that because people truly do spend different types of income differently. And it's almost a foregone conclusion that Social Security income is going to be spent. I do have the rare client that'll save a little bit of Social Security income, but almost everybody spends entirely all their Social Security benefit and just kind of assumes that's going to be what they would do. So yeah, I really don't think we can look at this in a vacuum, especially when we start to play out some of those stress test type scenarios where we start to see portfolios getting spent down and distribution rates that maybe even started at 8%. And that was fine, but they're moving up to 10, 12% higher rates as portfolios are falling. That person is probably not going to be enjoying the same sort of spending path that they would have had, I think, if they claimed their Social Security benefit earlier. So right or wrong, it's just definitely going to change how people approach that.
Yeah, Derek, I think I would just take in that example, the thing that comes to mind too is number one, they're probably not going to be, you may be right. You may be able to convince them, right? And say like, hey, here's what you should do. It makes the most sense. You're with them. They agree. They're like, yeah, okay, I get that. Mathematically, it all adds up in my head, like Derek said. And then they leave. And a few months down the road, this is the plan, but they don't feel comfortable with it. So they're stressed. They're not thinking, they're not sleeping well. Like, let's just say, for example, they're anxious about it. They forget why you brought this up in the first place, why you suggested it. Like it made sense when they were there, but then they leave and they go back to life and they can't remember why. And then I think also, maybe most importantly, is the best plan is the one that the client is able to execute on and stick to. And so you may be able to convince them, but if they can't stick to it because they're that uncomfortable, it's not going to work out the way that it's supposed to anyways. And again, it comes back. I'm going to reiterate what Michael said, like that I'm not sitting here. I don't think any of us are sitting here saying that there's a right way that you should claim early, right? It's just being more aware of all these factors that come into play from the human aspect, like the behavior of the client, the psychology of it. And so in that example, sure, you may be right. You may be able to convince them. And then 6 months later, if they're not able to stick to it, then you're back to square one. They're not happy. They're not comfortable. They don't have peace of mind. And nobody wins in that situation.
I thought I actually wanted to share some visuals. Derek, I know you had an article published, I think earlier this year, maybe last year, around helping clients visualize, painting a picture of what we do. And I do think sometimes when we just talk about it, it's not tangible, but when they can actually see the pictures, it makes a lot more sense. So let me just share an example here. And this is a very basic example. So we have a 61-year-old couple. They have $1 million to invest. John's PIA is $2,500. Mary's PIA is $3,000. And so I basically, and we can compare any, but I've sort of compared the extremes here. And so if we look at the two scenarios, one scenario, they delay filing as long as possible. The other one, they file at age 62. They're currently age 61. And so you can see, if you look at that in isolation here, you will see clearly the option of delaying would be the better option, right? You're generating $579,000 more of Social Security income. But what it doesn't take into consideration is everything else that's going to take place. So what we have here is showing how that plan, we're assuming they need $7,500 a month or $90,000 a year to live on. And so both plans, this is a stress test going into the global financial crisis. And you can see both plans start out with about the same withdrawal rate. So this is based on the portfolio withdrawal rate. Here in yellow, we are filing for Social Security. So you can see the withdrawal rate goes down. But as we hit the bear market, the blue line, which is delaying filing for Social Security, tends to go up, up, and up. Matter of fact, now we had a 15% withdrawal rate year over year. Really interesting way of looking at it. Now you can look at the portfolio balances as well. So the blue is the portfolio balance where you defer filing and therefore you have to fund retirement out of your current balance. The yellow is where you file immediately. And you can see there's a dramatic difference here. Now this is a number sort of game, right? It's just factual. It's run through this period of time with these assumptions. But Brandon, I'm sort of thinking about you here. What do you think these people felt going through this experience?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that sticks out to me is again, that top one, the top example, top chart, is I would have to imagine that in that scenario, when you sit there and you go, okay, so it requires a 15.4% withdrawal, that I don't know many people that are going to sit there and feel comfortable taking a 15.4% withdrawal. But what's most likely going to happen is, well, maybe they'll do it, but they don't feel comfortable. Or the other side of it is they go, I don't want to take that much. So then the conversation, instead of being around like, hey, what can we do? Where can we spend money to help you live your best life? It shifts and it becomes, they're going to want to know, hey, where do we need to cut back? What do we need to do differently? If I don't feel comfortable with spending that much out of my portfolio, I don't want to run out one day. Where do I dial back? When you start talking about dialing back, now you're talking about impacting their life, and that's never a fun conversation, right? The one that comes to mind as far as dialing back is because one I had many times would be like, all right, do we need to? So does that mean we need to sell the RV? Like, do we need to take less trips? And now you're talking about impacting somebody's life, right? And so I think in that example, you look at it and you go, that like, mathematically that works. And then you have to take a step back and go, but can a client actually do that and feel comfortable with it? Or will it lead to, hey, I need to pull back, I need to cut my spending instead?
Michael, Derek, any thoughts? I mean, the portfolio balance here, you can see there's quite a difference here, almost $500,000 here. Any thoughts? Again, the math is the math, but what's the experience that people have going through this?
Well, I mean, I think this is I think it's a good example of the unknown, right? So, I mean, you're using this example. I believe this is the financial crisis. Is that right?
Yeah. We go
you know, I mean, you could do, yeah, I mean, you could do it, but either way, like, the idea is we talk about, you know, we talk about like modeling things. We use all the simulations, and all the simulations can, you know, punch you in the face very quickly. And yeah, this plan can work, right? You can take those, you could have taken those withdrawals, but if you can see like what people's anxiety was at that moment, not just, so just forget about their personal portfolio, just the general anxiety of the world. And then to say, okay, no big deal, it's going to be fine. Like historically, everything is recovered. So let's just go ahead and take 15% of that portfolio this year. Don't worry though, it's going to be fine. That is, first of all, I think you would definitely want to make sure you did put that in the notes for a regulator to find. And second of all, like nobody is going to be like, yeah, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense in this environment, that I should do something that is more risky. So I think again, this is trying to, I think what this does is it allows you to have these conversations about that. Like, because some people I have a client who would be like, yeah, man, I got that. I get that. Like, I'm comfortable with things bouncing back. And that person would probably take that blue line. They'd be like, yeah, I'd do that. No big deal. I'd rather have higher Social Security. And I think just having the conversation with them, like, what does this look like? And he would be fine with it. Other people would be like, no, there's no way. I'm not going to do that.
go ahead. I'm sorry, Michael.
Well, I was gonna say, in the moment, you just don't know how people are gonna respond. I think Brendan this is basically me terribly rephrasing what Brendan said, but you don't know what it's gonna be like in that moment. You can imagine what it would be like. And those of you who were around in 2007 working with clients, I can tell you, I mean, if you weren't, I can tell you nobody was gonna be like, yeah, I'm gonna take 17% out. And those of you who are around them too. Sorry, what I didn't mean to go, Johnny.
I just wanted to say we're not suggesting that we're going to see the global financial crisis again. We're not suggesting that we're going to see the dot-com bubble again. But Derek, I know you wrote an article for Kids, as I mentioned earlier, so maybe you can speak to how it helps people better, digest the data.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's really just seeing and being able to actually walk somebody through these types of experiences, and actually seeing what, is out there. And I think, Johnny, if you go back to the global financial crisis example, again, it's especially looking at the portfolio differences that we see here. I think another component when we think about, because there's definitely value to longevity insurance. And again, I feel like even reading some of the comments, people are really trying to, they're coming away feeling like we're saying there's not value to that, or people shouldn't delay till 70. And that's not at all what we're saying. We're trying to say, we really, as advisors, need to even have some conversations with ourselves and think about, okay, should we look at this a little differently? And to me, this is showing the sequence of returns risk. That's often, this isn't even addressing the mortality risk, because there is somebody could pass away and be $400,000 less in lifetime benefits at kind of one extreme that they could have received. But this is showing that sequence of returns risk that's often not accounted for. Now, yes, longevity insurance is important, but another piece that even comes with the sequence of returns risk is even just the optionality that I think that there is to spending, where, that's one thing. You can't go to the Social Security Administration and say, you know what, going back to the RV example, like, we've decided it's time, we want to travel the country, we want to get an RV. Can you just give us our next 12 months of benefits so we can go make that purchase, right? You can't do that with Social Security. You're maximizing a fixed income stream, whereas you do have that ability in a portfolio to take more of a lump sum. But I think talking about the experience living through it, somebody on this blue line here, they're going to be feeling pretty not great about taking a big distribution for a once in a lifetime family trip, or for an RV, something, whatever it is for them personally that they value the most. And that's way different than, I think, being on that gold mine. And so I think that experience is really something that, really should be thought of, that just is often kind of glossed over.
Let me add one thing I think I forgot to mention. This is actually planning for both of them living to age 97. So it's not like I picked a short lifetime here, actually a rather long life expectancy. The other thing, I would say, I saw some comments. I mean, clearly it depends on the client. If you have a client with very little to invest, I mean, they probably want to file for Social Security earlier, where some higher net worth people may be feeling that they want to insure themselves for longevity risk. One of the scenarios where we typically see filing later being an advantage is if you have a long life and you have a really bad sequence of return towards the end of life, so not in the beginning. That's typically where we see it really pays off to file later on. Now, with all that said, we have a bunch of questions. Derek, you sort of promised me you would help with managing sort of our Q&A session here.
Second, let me find the Q&A here. All right. Want to make sure it looks like it's sorting by likes. Yeah. So if, and for anybody that wants to jump in, if you do want to like something, if you want to move it up kind of in the queue in the Q&A here, we'll kind of start from the top here. Let's see. Clients are really feeling the anxiety. The benefits will be reduced because Congress is doing nothing to address trust fund shortfall. I guess, not even sure that was quite a question, but I do think the policy risk, right? That's something that should be accounted for clients, right? Some clients are going to feel that's a bigger risk than others. Some are going to feel more psychological distress if that were to happen than others. And so again, these are all kind of unique circumstances I think we should weigh, but like in the new Income Lab tool, that's something that you specifically can model based on the client's own beliefs and preferences there. Well, let me change. Okay, there we go. I added on the wrong setting to see the upvotes here. Let's see. Maybe throw this question out. I, I think I've kind of given my perspective of this, but I'm curious for maybe the other panelists. It says, don't you think the longevity insurance aspect of Social Security claiming isn't an important or maybe the most important factor, especially to protect the spouse with the longest life expectancy, who may be the lower earning spouse? So, Mike, Brendan, any thoughts on
Well, it depends on the household dynamics, right? So I think the example I gave earlier with that client, she was divorced, so she had no survivor. So just as a really good example, a really easy example of how we can't assume everybody's going to be the same. Now, if you're working with couples, that could be that could there could be a different answer. But what if it might be the lower wage earning spouse that you're talking about. So I think it kind of depends on the dynamics. I do think longevity insurance is important. Especially for people who are healthy, people who have longevity in their family. I think I think it makes sense to err on the side of longevity risk, like to be concerned by that. But it's not everything. Right? It's not there are people who are pretty unhealthy, and they can live long still, right? But maybe they're not going to change their habits. Maybe they're not going to live very long. And so maximizing what life they have left may make sense. I would say the most important aspect of Social Security is the fact that it provides a benefit of an amount of income you're going to have on a monthly basis to meet your needs, right? It creates predictable financial management, that portion of it at least, right? So I think that's the most important. I don't know if that whether it's the reduced benefit, whether it's the max benefit, it's a known amount, and you can operate off of that.
Yeah, I pretty much I would echo everything Michael said. Very situation dependent. A lot of factors to consider. For many people, is that the most valuable aspect of it? Probably so. But again, at the end, like what Michael said, it's the real value of it. The biggest benefit of it is just the predictability, knowing that no matter what happens, most likely, it'll always be there. It's a predictable amount. It's always coming in, no matter how long you live. There's peace of mind that comes with that frees up other portions of your mind, your life, but also your portfolio.
Let me add a real story. So my neighbors, Kevin and Gabby, is a great example of this. Kevin is 62, she's 52. He's the main breadwinner, so he would receive the higher amount of Social Security. So that probably would be a case where Kevin wanted delay, right? But I think the psychological part here is really important. Kevin's number one concern in life is Gabby's well-being when he's no longer here. So forget about the math for a second. For him, it's important to delay filing for Social Security because that's his concern. He wants to make sure she is covered if he's no longer here. So I think that's a good example of where the math probably support for him to file later, but the psychological part of it is hugely important as well. Derek, I see some questions around the opportunity cost. I know you have written an article that haven't been published yet on it, but maybe you could speak to some of that.
Yeah, and I did see, I think Danny had a question too, asking if, kind of breaking down a process to go through it. And that's something I'm currently working on, an article that would really go into that. So don't have anything to share immediately, but I do think kind of thinking about all these different risks. So, the opportunity cost is one that we could probably do a whole presentation on that, but a lot of the research uses 0% under the assumption that really Social Security is treating it like it's a tips like risk profile. And there is contention there. So if you look at people like Michael Kitces have really pushed back on that idea and very strongly stated, no, he doesn't think that's the correct way. You should actually be looking at the opportunity cost of the portfolio that you're pulling funds from. Even though these aren't apples to apples from a risk perspective, in reality, that's actually, if you're spending down a 60-40 portfolio, that's actually what you're displacing that with. And so, if you look at historical, you look at real risk premiums there for a 60-40 portfolio, looking at something like a 4 to 5% discount rate is not unreasonable. And then once you start to, again, you can use Income Lab, you can play around with the discount rates. I think even beyond that, you should adjust that discount rate for mortality risk, for sequence of returns risk, for longevity protection, right? So that might be something that even brings it down because that longevity insurance is there. And so I think you should kind of do a netting sort of exercise is my quick answer to what I think people should do. But that would be where you can apply that discount rate, and then you can actually decide from there. That helps inform the value and the trade-offs, I think, of that. So that's personally how I look at that. But again, that's very different because most of the research uses a 0% discount rate. If they stress test the results, maybe they use like a 2% real discount rate. But again, historical actual premiums for a 60-40 portfolio are something more like 4 to 5%. So that stress test really isn't reflecting how people are actually spending down their portfolios in most cases. See another question here, Colin, that's gotten some upvotes. Do you ever recommend taking a wait and see approach to delaying claiming? In other words, if markets continue to do well, we plan to delay. If we hit another downturn of a certain size, we decide to claim sooner. And actually, I'll jump in, just say personally, I think this can be something that really makes sense to do, right? We kind of frame some of these scenarios and looking at the extremes, but the reality is we can wait and see. And even, we have that 6-month retroactive claiming option with Social Security. So it could be something where you could actually even turn back the clock 6 months. And I know Jeff Levine at kitsis.com, he's talked about kind of taking it 6 months at a time. Are we going to defer another 6 months? Or are we going to defer another 6 months instead of making it this big, got to claim at 62 or 70? But I don't know. Does anybody else want to jump in on that one?
No, I mean, I think it's why it's important to just kind of have the conversation, is that there are a lot of options. There's a lot of optionality available for you. And I think the standard thing is when somebody reads something in the Wall Street Journal that says claiming at 70 is always the best thing to do. I think as personal financial planners, we should push back on that. And that situationally, it makes sense sometimes to do something different. And clients are different. And I think there was a comment in here about, that our job is to show people what is best. I have this conversation with students all the time, is that what is optimal, because we should show them what's optimal, right? Absolutely show them what's optimal, is not always best, because best is situational. It's idiosyncratic to the client, to the macro situation, to their micro situation. So I think that's kind of use the tools that are available. Do the 6-month delay if it makes sense. If you're about to retire and there's a downturn, maybe it makes sense to not pull from the portfolio for a while things recover. I mean, people have different strategies around this anyway. Have 3 years of cash in reserves. Here's my 10 bucket strategy or 20 bucket strategy. Whatever it might be. We have different strategies to manage those. Should be no difference with Social Security. Use what's available.
I think we probably have time for one more question. Do you have another one, Derek, that you see?
I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here kind of themed around, the anxiety, I think, around Social Security reduction. Brendan, I'd be kind of curious for your perspective. I mean, from a psychological perspective, how should we be thinking about that? Should that weigh into how people are thinking about actually claiming?
I think from the advisor's point of view, with that scenario, it's more about being aware of what's happening psychologically in that moment. So if you have somebody that's particularly worried or concerned, or they're all caught up in the fact that, hey, we really believe that this is going to be gone in a few years, or they're like, hey, we don't trust the current regime, whatever. If there's fear around the long-term existence of Social Security, what that naturally, not always, by the way, if there's been a theme, it's that there really is no blanket statement, unfortunately. But what that typically shows up as or manifests in is somebody who has the tendency to want to claim earlier, right? So they're going, hey, if it may not be around forever, if I feel like it's going to change or adjust, or if I think I'm going to, quite frankly, another one's if I think I'm not going to live very long, that lends itself to saying I need to claim sooner so that I can get more out of it. This was mine that I paid into. I don't want to miss out on something in the future. So it's just simply being aware that if that's a core belief, that's something that's the anxiety is palpable and you have a client that feels that way, not always, but there's the tendency to lean more towards claiming earlier than they normally would. And so that would be an example of, if you're aware of that, if you see that presenting itself, then you can have a more informed conversation, guide the conversation to consider why they may want to delay longer, right? Just know what's happening. Why is this guiding them or steering them towards one lane? And then how can you help them make a more informed decision where it's not as biased, essentially.
Well, thank you very much to everyone. We're running out of time.